Okay, welcome to the Tuesday, April 2nd, 2019 Working Group Component Standard meeting, everyone. We have a few items on the agenda here. So let's get started. So the first thing was I finally got some time to get back to the K-flag stuff this morning. So I renamed the whole thing to Legacy Flag to indicate that it's sort of this migration shim, as Daniel recommended. I think that's all that really had to happen before merging the CAP. So I pinned Daniel and David Eads on GitHub. So hopefully they approve that soon, and then we can merge it and get the repo and move forward with that work. That was my thing. As long as everybody's cool with that name.
I'm not a fan, but I agree with everything which moves us forward.
Yeah, that's my feeling as well.
It's a symbol rename. Or do we have to chase down any owners? Are we using K-flag yet anywhere?
No, it's just a proposal.
Okay.
Yeah. So we want to merge the proposal.
Well, thanks. Moving to this 74111, which is the config serializer patch. Is Stuart on? Doesn't look like he's joining us today.
He's in China, I don't think.
Yeah, it would be a stretch for sure. So there's some good progress on this PR. We've been really trying to push it forward since it's a dependency for basically any work on component config. Mm-hmm. And we had a contentious symbol rename, of an important portion of that API, and then there's lots of nitpicks, and it's currently waiting on Stuart right now, but in general, this seems to be moving forward. Some of the following patches that I'm working on that originally were Lucas's work are dependent on this. Does anybody have any comments or concerns with some of the feedback that API machinery is being provided? Cool. Okay, we can move on from that. This next patch is not dependent on the config serializer. It's just a test lib for API groups. I unearthed some comments in here that Lucas had kind of left that were unimplemented. And we basically need to kind of assert some things about a scheme when we are creating the component APIs. So this is things just like making sure that it has an exclusive init function, I think. I haven't really looked into the technical details of this. And then that exclusive init function only registers at least one type, I think is the test. So if anybody has any comments or about dragons that I might run into trying to implement that, I really have no idea what I'm doing there, but I'm gonna need to figure that out. Stefan, do you have any context on this portion of the implementation for the API group?
I didn't look into much detail.
Okay.
I was just waiting until the work in progress goes away, and then.
Yeah. Did anybody talk with Lucas about these requirements, or is it just something that he kind of was working on by himself?
Yeah, I haven't talked to him about it.
Okay, I'll see if I can dig into it. It might be. I just have to probably do some reflection to figure out what types to look for in the scheme. But.
Yeah, it looks like the vast majority of this looks like it's enforcing naming conventions.
Yeah, so that's the only bit that's unimplemented is the scheme tests, which I might break out into a separate test lib, maybe? I don't know. Since it's not really about I guess you could say it's related to the API group. But
Yeah, I mean, there's no need to make it too complicated.
So this, aside from that missing functionality of what was originally intended, I think this patch should be pretty functional. I
It
think we
looks like
should
that's a
have
pretty small part of this patch. I wouldn't be opposed to merging the.
a separate one.
Granted that it's tests, and it's always better to have better test coverage. Like, we shouldn't wait to merge.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I definitely can do the scheme tests in a separate patch.
Yeah.
What's your opinion about checking in a test lib without having any dependent tests on it?
Like checking in a library without
Mhm.
anything that actually uses it to test things.
Yeah.
In you might want to. Why don't you use it to test at least one component's
Okay.
configuration?
Yeah. If that's a good thing to do, I can. Lucas has a bunch of upstream stubs that I can rebase some of them in.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea so that it'll help it avoid rotting.
I'll probably do the KubeADM ones, since that can just keep it within the same group of owners, more or less. And then the other components, such as controller manager and API server, we can do in separate patches.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I'll do that for both patches. I'll split up the KubeADM tests and rebase them in. And then the second one depends on the config serializer. So it's a little gnarly as the config serializer continues to change with review comments. But otherwise, it should be functionally ready, and then I'll add the tests to that. So that's my full update there.
Awesome.
Which means we should be able to start progressing to getting the other patches merged. Like, there's just a bunch of other dependent work that Lucas had staged beyond these three things, but it's all dependent and with lots of different owners.
Got it. Yeah, I'd have to look through this more deeply to understand that tree.
Okay. That's been mostly what I've been doing over the past couple of weeks, is just like grokking what is necessary. This is definitely like plenty of work, but we've got, another 20 minutes of this meeting probably to chat about where we can continue to take the project. I'm still ramping up on a lot of context here. What are some of the next wins that we can?
Yeah, so I think one of the the thing that's always on my mind is just the ongoing component config migrations, and are they making progress? Since it's kind of grunt work, but it's also kind of like work that has to be done to actually make all this stuff useful. So
I see two big working packages. One is to really use this K-flag or legacy flag in one of the big components.
yes.
We are pretty far in Kube Scheduler. There we have a component config, and we are pretty far in Controller Manager.
Yeah.
There's no component config, but we have the option structs, which are the same thing, basically. So one of those components should be implemented using this new library.
Yeah, I was thinking of just doing kubelet as well. I'm not sure it'll be that complicated. I think it's like it's just like there's a lot of flags, but I don't think it's too deep.
Maybe scheduler is the most easy one.
It might be.
It's not too big.
Kubeproxy actually might be.
Yeah, there we have a lot of options. But it doesn't really matter. But we need one which goes forward.
Yeah, so I want to get that kept merged this week and then get a repo allocated so that we can actually start playing around with these open PRs around what it looks like to use it.
Not kubeproxy. Kubeproxy maybe as well. Kube Scheduler and Kube Controller Manager, all of them are possible targets for that.
Yeah.
And we should do one just to test out the library.
Yeah, but then in parallel to that, we have, a lot of components do sort of have especially kubelet, a component config that is useful. I don't know how many other ones are in beta. But if there are, we should be trying to put forward the flag migrations, because if they've managed to get to beta and they've done whatever, like with Kubelet, whatever is necessary to be backwards compatible, even if it's ugly, we still need to move forward those.
So I think Kube Scheduler is alpha, when I'm not wrong, but it suggests to use the alpha config instead of flex, so it's a bit in the middle.
That's an interesting recommendation.
Yeah, well, an alpha API is better than canonical.
And no API.
Command line interface, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a deprecation policy for flag that's stronger than the alpha deprecation policy.
So this is a big first package. The second one is if we want to move forward with controller manager, we need this cap about the actual types. One big question was type meta in every controller struct or just one high level one. There's a PR maybe from Stuart as well, which was closed yesterday.
PR about the adding type meta to all the.
Yes, that's what I meant. And okay. Jordan closed it yesterday because there was disagreement, obviously. Somebody has to write a high level cap about the API style, which we want.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I don't have time to do that in the near term. But yeah, hopefully somebody volunteers to do that.
Yeah, so the big question is API group and version per struct or not.
You know, it might not be that complicated of a question, right? If you need to serialize them independently, you need that, right?
Yeah, that's just this usability question. If you have to write out like 20 different API groups and versions, it's getting complicated.
Maybe. I mean, if they're all the same, because you're in, well, they'd all be different. So yeah, you can't just copy paste, right?
Yes, they will be the same in 95% of the cases. And then you have one which is a different version for some reason.
I still kind of hedge on the side of like making people write them.
Yeah, anyway, I mean, there are different ways to do that. We could have one big struct for the main case and in one API version, and maybe just a general list variant for different ones, something like that. Somebody has to write it out, and we have to decide.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed some of this. So basically, there's some friction in adding type meta on all of the substructs for each component, right?
Yes.
So for me, just about the API, it makes sense for the substructs to be usable and for somebody to say, like, if they wanted to specify those control loops to be run outside of the controller manager, right? That's technically the most open API we could design, is that those things could be broken out into something that's not the kube controller manager component config. But
yeah,
I
in
mean,
this case, we need type meta, of course.
Yeah, that's my only opinion on that. Otherwise, however we shape it. So I don't know if I have.
It also relates to.
Come here and kept for that.
Sorry. Did you just say you can write a cap for that?
I don't know if I have a context, but I'm willing to take the time to at least draft up something.
Yeah, start something. I think that's the most important step.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
well, I can
definitely review something if somebody starts it. So.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I will. I'll see what I can do.
Sweet. Some of this stuff will relate to like the patterns and controller runtime. Like there's a possible idea of like all controllers are ultimately hosted in something like controller runtime, even if they're split out, it'll just be one controller in a controller runtime. So there may be some things around that. As far as you have all these controller configs and composing them together. I don't know how much of that you want to put in this KEP if you just want to talk about the types.
I would concentrate on the types.
Just be aware that there may be some thread of comment.
And you said that there might already be an implementation in controller runtime, or
So controller runtime is I guess a library / framework for writing controllers. Polyros is one of the main people behind it.
But it's a different style. It has different clients, so it's not a drop-in we can just use.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
But they have some kind of config structures that you think might inspire this API?
No, it's more of an architectural pattern for writing a controller manager with several controllers in it.
So that's how it ties into being generic.
Your controller and that stuff. So as we get into like, here's my controller manager, there's all these subcontrollers, they each have a configuration, and there's stuff that's shared between them, like auth config, then maybe separating, controller runtimes handle all the auth and client and whatever else config, and then the controllers themselves just get their component configs. And, so there's that. So there's a question of like, even if each of these controllers has, an independent API group and type, maybe there's some other objects where their shared state exists. So like there might be a trade-off of like, yeah, you have to write the API group and like the GVK for, all these objects, but also you don't have to like duplicate all this other stuff when we split them out. So it might actually balance out.
Yeah, I think I hear what you're saying there. And just that stuff makes sense to me with regard to like, I've done a lot of merging of config hierarchically, like in a structured way in CI and that kind of thing. And like having components that can own like some kind of abstraction around the config structure, and then produce more complicated sections that can be passed on to smaller components. It sounds like that's the same pattern that could be emerging in the kind of controller runtime section.
Yeah, it might be something like that. It might be like you have, controller runtime config is a component config for the controller runtime, and then whatever controllers you have in it each get their own configs, and then there's there'd be like an internal interface for what a controller looks like and what gets injected into it, and the runtime constructs all that from its config and injects it at runtime. So
I'm so glad you understood exactly what I was saying. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then there's a big, not so big actually, one package. Somebody likes to move code and refactor. So we have this HTTPS code in the API server, like listening on a port and setting up everything, SNI and so on. This whole, it's a kind of sublib of API server at the moment. This whole part should be moved to component base. I think it's pretty uncontroversial. It's not a rewrite, it's really code move and getting dependencies right and splitting some things apart maybe. And we use it already in scheduler, controller manager, and API servers. So it's pretty widely used and independent from API servers, actually.
there's also an item that came up a few meetings ago about Klog, and just it's literally a fork of glog with some modifications, and wondering if we should think about what really is the logging API that we actually want, because Klog is rather complicated internally, and we could probably simplify that experience. That's another possible item.
I would try to keep it out of this group for the moment. This can employ us for months and years, probably.
Right. So, yeah, let's not spend too much time on it. If somebody does want to tackle that for whatever reason, I'm happy to help.
There might be some bike shedding involved.
I think, yeah, it's also not clear like what the responsibilities of our logging library should be. Like there are probably good arguments for adding features to it, like internal log rotation and stuff like that it doesn't do a very good job of today. Yeah, as you said, bike shedding.
I mean, that's a pretty, kind of important SIG cluster lifecycle concern. So,
That's true.
There's gosh, who was it? Somebody in the community had a story of like a couple years ago being an early dev and then running Kafka on her laptop. And then about a year and a half later, it was filled up with logs, but she didn't know how to debug it. So she just nuked the laptop and reinstalled.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. But I mean, like that kind of thing, it's like, that's going to happen to a Kubernetes cluster, like, and it's not that people shouldn't be smarter, but like your system can be easier to use.
Right.
And so SIG cluster lifecycle has to have that somewhere.
Cool. One other thing that I've been meaning to get to, but haven't had time in the last few months, is to get back to the like broader component config API design discussion of how to handle instance specific configuration. So those sort of remaining flags that, like, if you want to share a config object, you can't share those flags, like node IP or host name would be one of them. Right, like every node needs a unique host name, so you can't just set a config app to configure 15 nodes with the same host name.
Yeah,
So
have we talked much about like ordered merging of configs?
no, we also haven't talked at all about like templating of configs, so especially since that falls under like a lot of the customized discussions and the apply work.
Yeah, like programmatic mutation of configs, be it templating or like patching or extensions with languages, is in my mind like a outside concern. Like it's not really declarative.
There are areas where it could simplify certain things. Like there may be cases or where some auto detection or auto configuration could simplify things, like what architectural layer it should be in is maybe an open question, but there's things like, well, kubeproxy needs to have hostname override set to the same value as kubelet. Maybe there's a way to coordinate that automatically, right? Like there's the sort of, I guess, naive solution is just to say, well, the provider should just do it when they set things up, right? Like GKE does all that stuff internally, and that seems to work okay. But maybe there's a simpler way to do it. I don't know. So there's that one for instance specific. There's also like a question, I tried writing a doc on this like over a year ago, it feels like, on how to deal with like platform specific options. So if you have options that only work on Windows or only work on Linux, is there like a standard sort of style that we can land on for how to structure that in configuration? Whether we say it's all flat namespace, or we do like a discriminated union per platform, or what. And yeah, I wrote a doc on that ages ago, which didn't really take a nuanced approach. and just kind of said you have to use a discriminated union because it's the only way to properly isolate these things. But that's something I'd like to get back to too, is figure out how to handle, like, this thing only works on Windows, this only works on Linux, like especially for components like kubeproxy where it's like all networking stuff and it's totally different on different platforms. So I don't know where that doc is. I have to find the link.
Yeah, let's try to distill some of this into bullet points so we don't forget about it.
Yeah, I can write some. There, I found the doc. Oh, it's not broadly shared. Let me get a link. It should be shared with Kubernetes Dev.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, take that with a huge grain of salt. It was pretty hard line. Like, yeah.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that definitely makes sense. Is like, what are the config structures and patterns that we expect? That definitely seems like something you would want to have enforced in your API, and then have the config stuff catch a OS specific error before the controller loop starts or whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah. And that's not something anybody should have to write over and over again. Like that's a pretty general need.
Right.
Um,
The other question too is like, how do these things grow, right? So if you start off with parameters that maybe only work on one platform or the other, and then that feature gets ported to the other platform, do you lift that parameter up to a higher level? Do you just represent it in both and duplicate it, over time? Is there a way to minimize the complexity growth of the APIs?
in like something like kubeproxy, right, where that's so specific to the platform implementation, I would say like my instinct is to keep that, in the OS specific portion of the config as, you bolt on another platform and now it's like, this thing is not supported. But then managing the API could be pretty simple because like that could be like a shared flags section, or I don't know.
Yeah, it's not exactly a trivial problem.
No, yeah.
As you get into it, it's probably because there are just like enough different situations that it might be just hard to generalize across all of them. But I still think we can probably come up with something reasonable, and then maybe have some areas where we say, look, these are the different options you have depending on where you sit.
Yeah, so that's probably at least mostly docs, right?
Yeah.
So we should expand on your docs to. Do we need to cap that?
We do need to cap it. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
It's something that should get merged into like API conventions after it's been discussed. And it's also going to it's something that could generalize to Kubernetes APIs. Right, we've added Windows in 1.14. However, lots of features don't work on Windows. Right, there's lots of kubelet field or pod fields that are unsupported, etc. So maybe having a better way to differentiate between platforms and APIs would, get around the requirement to write like a bunch of admission webhooks to protect people when you had a platform.
Mm-hmm. All right. So just kind of doing a recap of what we talked about. You've got the legacy flag kept, and we need some reviews on that so that it's going to be merged.
It's basically been reviewed. We just need LavaLamp or DEADS to throw a slash.
Okay. So we'll need final okay.
Yeah.
And then Stuart's working on this. A bunch of our work is dependent on it. Actively, I'll do some rebasing of the API group and defaulting round-tripping stuff to include the kubeadm tests. Perhaps we'll do the scheme testing in another patch if that looks complicated. We talked about component config migrations for existing components in core. And an important one there is that the controller manager has some friction on type meta. So I'm going to write a KEP for this. We can kind of start looking at what that API is going to be like. There is some probably interesting patterns. This might be generic enough to be inspired by what controller runtime is doing with managing multiple control loops. Stefan thinks a next big step is to get legacy flag into one of our core components. Puffin, you talked about how it's probably important that the one component that we do pick in order for this to be implemented has a solid component config so that we can suss out any dragons there.
It doesn't have to be super solid. It just has to, like, any component that's in the middle of a migration would be a good pick, just to show that it simplifies whatever the existing code is.
Right. Okay.
So, my personal bias is kubelet, just because that's the one I was working on and I know that code. Stefan knows the controller manager stuff a lot better, and can speak more to like the pattern that makes the most sense there.
Okay. That work, we don't really have like tracking around. Is everything labeled at least? All the PRs?
Yeah, there is actually a tracking issue.
I know the tracking issue that you made. It's just it doesn't include some of that stuff.
Yeah,
right?
feel free to add stuff to it as well. Like that was just a first pass.
Do we maybe want to turn this into like a project board? Because I don't know if I have permission to edit the tracking issue directly, right? Like I need to add comments in order to append and modify this.
Okay, I didn't realize that because I can edit everything apparently.
Yeah.
Let's do that. If it's a matter of permissions, let's make a project board. We can put that on component base too, which would be probably a better place for this. I think.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think we can do. I think we might even have a project board there set up already.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how like we track all these moving pieces because like some of the things you mentioned, right? Like I haven't even looked at those patches and I don't know where they are. It seems like, oh yeah, okay. So you have these in the tracking issue, the kube controller manager stuff.
There's this project board, which is actually in KK, called component base.
Okay.
So we can move some of these items in there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I honestly haven't used these project boards enough to know if there's ample place for discussion and documentation regarding like we'll still probably need the tracking issue on this board.
Yeah, I think we will still need the tracking issue.
Yeah.
There's like the project board's just linked to PRs and issues.
Yeah, but this is just an easier way to see what's in the
Right.
project and what the state of it is in. So we can use both of those together. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll see if I can do some cleanup there. And then back to what we were talking about. So once we get like the legacy flag stuff into a component, we also need to do this library move for the API server, HTTPS serving stuff. Apparently
that can be separate from legacy flag.
That's
Yeah.
totally independent.
Yeah, those are independent things. And then we talked about this Klog thing and then decided not to talk about it. And we've got stuff to chat about regarding the instance and platform specific sections of the config. I think it's a good suggestion to have some kind of library support regarding component config with respect to merging of configs, however simple that can look.
I think there are things like with merging related to whatever we do with the future dynamic kubelet config to make that API easier to use. There may be some options there. I don't want to get too into that yet. I think we have more than enough on our plate before we address that API.
Yeah. Just I guess to clarify, like what I'm specifying here is that, user could specify a list of files, via flag or whatever, to say load this config, and then this config takes precedence, and then this config takes precedence. Right.
I see. Yeah.
It's kind of similar to how values are specified for a Helm chart, with the deep merging. Because that allows somebody to come in and say, and except for this, do that instead. Platform specific config, we talked about the OS stuff, and then I'll do cleanup on the project management things. So cool. That's a lot of stuff to get moving. And does anybody else have anything that they wanted to bring up? We are currently 11 over.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Hi, Martin.
Hi. So I try to, for example, use the types which are in the config in the v1 alpha, and I found that it's impossible to actually do defaulting with them because all those fields there, they don't have, for example, omit empty. So I cannot, in my code, I cannot be 100% sure when I serialize, some YAML with my configuration that, for example, this field is empty, or this field, for example, is if it's an integer, it's 0. And I'm not sure how this thing can be handled.
I think most fields should have a mid-empty. If they don't, that's just probably because it's an alpha API and it's still wrong, and that needs to be fixed before it can get beta. I also would expect, I guess, APIs that don't have a mid-empty set up correctly to fill certain round-trip tests.
Yeah. Some of the API group testing stuff that Lucas wrote that I'm refactoring right now handles some of those edge cases with regard to things not having annotations.
Yeah, so I think this is a case where we need those better tests.
Martin, this was for which alpha API?
In the component base, you have the config, and then you have v1 alpha, and for the common types, for example, the client configuration, leader election, I think was there as well, right?
I don't think we've done any work on component-based leader election, and our previous meeting we talked about how that was going to be.
That's kubescheduler, isn't it?
I thought we moved some types into component base, didn't we, Stefan?
Yeah, I think kubescheduler has some lead election types.
Yeah, we can.
Anyway, the concern is that some existing APIs are likely constructed incorrectly, right?
Yeah, I mean, right now with those types that are currently available in the component-based repository, you cannot do defaulting because all those types are all those fields they don't have, for example, emit empty. They don't have the optional tag as well, so you cannot actually generate a schema for it. And yeah.
Open an PR to start the discussion.
Yeah.
So
If
there,
it's just adding the correct tags to those structs, then yeah, just open a PR.
And that might be a good place to add some example tests for the defaulting PR that I have. At the beginning, or like kind of in the middle of the meeting notes, Martin, the PR number is 75689. That's a defaulting round trip test lib suite for these kinds of problems. And so if we don't already have a test that covers that edge case, then we need that in there. And then if we, before we merge that PR, that might be a good place to add some dependent examples. So I can probably work on that with you if you're concerned about the area, or the quality of this area data.
Awesome. Thanks, Martin. We're noticing that. Okay. That's everything I have, folks.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. We're definitely very over on this. Thanks everyone for all of the intentional input. We'll get this moving. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody.
Goodbye.
thank you. See you.
Mm-hmm.